My name is Olaf Kolkman. I'm the Chief Internet Technology Officer of the Internet Society. I realize that this is my first time to join the Cybersecurity Special Interest Group, which I'm actually very happy is part of. You've been active in organizing webinars like this, and I hope we can contribute and participate in a couple of more. I already saw my colleague Steve Olshansky joining here too. One of the things that we will be engaging with you in is our work on IoT security. That is all forthcoming. But today we're going to talk about cyber diplomacy, about norms, stability and deterrence in cyberspace. And the person who is going to introduce and discuss most of this topic is Chris Painter. Chris Painter is a well-established specialist in cyber diplomacy and cyber policy issues. He comes out of Stanford Law with a Stanford Law degree. He entered prosecution. He's worked for the FBI. He's worked for several departments, and all through his career, cyber has been one of the key focus areas. He's been advisor to the White House. He has written cyber policy advisories that became key and central to the US policy on cyber. I came to know Chris in the Global Commission for the Stability of Cyberspace, where I'm happy to serve, and he is a commissioner too. I get to know him a little bit personally, and one of the interests that he has, which fascinates me because it's sort of my interest too, is movies. And one of the things that I discovered is that he has a sort of a weekly tweet about the Cyber Movie, which is a movie which has a cyber theme, where cyber developments, cyber policy, or cyber problems form a key motive in the movie. I have had a preview of the slide deck, and based on one of his tweets, I actually saw the movie which he refers to, the Colossus Project, which is an excellent movie from the early 70s. But I won't talk about that. I leave that completely to Chris in the context of norms, stability, and deterrence in cyberspace. Logistically, before we head over, let's continue the conversation while we're having it. If you have questions, please post them in the chat box by voice or raise your hand by voice. I will take them in order, allow everybody to speak. While you're listening, please stay muted. If you unmute, I might actually be muting you. So that's a sort of a logistic request. With that, Chris, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Olaf. And it's a great pleasure to be here today. And I'm a big fan of ISOC and its special interest groups. When I was in the government, I often participated in various ISOC events. And now that I'm out of the government, I'm actually now a member of ISOC. So I'm very supportive of the group and all of it does. And certainly I'm happy to be here today to talk to you folks about diplomacy, norm, stability, and deterrence in cyberspace. Some things I've been working on a fair number of years. I've been working on cyber issues now, I think, for about 27 years, which is a long time. And back before there really was a World Wide Web, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. I am a recovering lawyer, as Olaf said. I was a prosecutor for a number of years, and normally when you give a speech or give a talk or even give a webinar, you try to break the ice by telling some kind of joke. And I could use normally you tell a lawyer joke, but the problem that I found in my long career as a lawyer and not as a lawyer is the problem with lawyer jokes is that lawyers don't think they're funny and non-lawyers don't think they're jokes. So I'll dispense with that today and instead get into the heart of what I want to talk about. I'm now a recovering lawyer and a recovering diplomat. And I was recently the top cyber diplomat for the US. And in that role, as I said, I've been involved in these issues in a number of different ways. And today I want to talk first about the threats we're seeing in cyberspace. And many of you who are part of this SIG know those threats very well and have been involved in those. And I also want to talk about what we're doing to combat those threats on a policy level, and also really talk about the role of diplomacy, which is a relatively new field in both seizing the opportunities in cyberspace, but also combating the threats. And part of that is the short-term cooperation we do to fight the threats, but the part of it is also the longer-term issue of cyber stability. How do we achieve stability in cyberspace that makes this safe or safer for all of us? And what stability really means and what a framework of stability looks like. And then finally, I want to talk about deterrence in cyberspace, something I think we frankly don't do a very good job on, which is really making sure there are costs for bad actors in cyberspace so that there's some deterrence and they won't do it again. So those are the topics I want to talk about. I also want to explain during the course of my talk with this, a slide of zombies, has to do with this, a slide of old-timey diplomats and why that makes a difference. And then as Olaf hinted, I also want to explain my obsession with this. And this is the poster, and Olaf was right. Back when I was at the State Department for about 6.5 years, I tried to make my office something that was unique for the State Department. So I put about 30 movie posters where hackers or computers were the main characters. And there were a lot of these movies. There was War Games, of course, The Matrix, The Computer Who Wore Tennis Shoes, Her, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, many different posters. But my favorite was really this. And it was this because this is the first movie where computers took over the world. And many of these movies, many of these cyber movies, are dystopian in some way. There are very few uplifting cyber or hacking movies, but this was the first movie where computers took over the world. The US built Colossus, the name of the movie, which is this giant computer in a mountain in Colorado, to control its nuclear arsenal and take the man out of the middle and have perfect deterrence. The Soviets at the time, it was the Soviets in 1970, stole the information and built their version, Guardian, in the Urals. The two computers talk to each other, they become self-aware, and they decide to protect humankind from itself and its destructive tendencies. They're going to take over the world. I remember sitting in the theater and watching this movie when I was a young kid, and I sat through it twice, which tells you something about, I guess, my interest in my career. And indeed, my first computer, which some of you will recognize, is this, an Atari 800, a great computer for its time, one of the first multitasking computers. And it even had a cassette tape drive that didn't have a hard drive at the time. So I've always been interested in computers. I've always been interested in the merger between computers and security. And of course, now we carry very powerful computers in our pockets every day. We use powerful computers. Society is very focused and dependent on computers. And while the internet has been, as all of us know, a tremendous source for good in terms of commerce, in terms of social development around the world, it's also been a target for criminals, malicious nation states, terrorists, and others. And while the internet has also been a powerful tool for people to organize and discuss issues around the world, it's also been used by more repressive regimes to allow those regimes to monitor dissidents and undermine democratic processes. So no technology on its own is all good or all bad. It's a technology, it's how it's used, and we've seen both of these. And because of the global nature of computers and computer networks, again, something all of you know well, there's always an international dimension to this. There's always an international technical dimension, and there's always an international policy dimension. And it's necessary and really important for us to work globally on these issues, both nationally but also globally, both in thwarting technical threats, but also working on the policy threats. And I can say I've been very fortunate to be on the front row and observing and participating in the evolution both of the technology, but also in our response. Yeah, as Olaf said, I started as a prosecutor in Los Angeles in the 90s, prosecuting some of the big cybercrime cases back then, Kevin Mitnick and others, and the first stock manipulation cases. I went to the mothership at Department of Justice. I went to the White House, the FBI, the White House, and then finally at State. And so I have, I think, a perspective on how those things have changed. And I've also, I think, have a unique perspective on this burgeoning role, this new role means. So let me just briefly address the threat. And again, I think many of you are familiar with this because, first of all, you're in the cybersecurity SIG. Secondly, because it's on the front pages of every paper and every magazine and every television show almost every day. You heard the Wall Street, or you saw the Wall Street Journal story, I think, in just the last couple of days, saying, for instance, that there was a discovery of malware, Russian attributed malware on the electrical power grid in the US, and that was all over the TV. There's been stories about data breaches, the criminal data breaches and criminal activities. And the range of threat actors that we've seen has expanded dramatically from nation states, transnational organized criminal groups, what I call lone gunman hackers, the people who just do this on their own. Terrorists, we're still worried about terrorists, although terrorists use the internet more to communicate than try to cause destruction so far. And even a mix of those various groups where, for instance, you have nation states using criminal groups as proxies. And we've seen many, many high-profile events, Equifax in terms of a major data breach, ransomware attacks like WannaCry and NotPetya. As I look at the evolution, back when I was doing and prosecuting Kevin Mitnick back in the late 90s, or doing some of these early stock manipulation cases, that was pretty novel at the time, and people weren't as dependent on the internet. And many thought that hackers were, malicious hackers were Robin Hoods because they weren't dependent and they didn't see how this really affected them, and that's changed dramatically. Back when I was a prosecutor, as I said, Mitnick was one case. The first stock manipulation case was a case called Pair Game, where someone created a fake Bloomberg web page that was really just a copy of the real Bloomberg web page with links to that page, and it it created a false story about a company, Pair Game, being bought for a lot of money that made people trade in the stock, including people as famous as James Cramer, and lose lots of money in a very short time, and it turned out to all be a hoax. We then later on in the year 2000 had a big denial of service case that attacked eBay and CNN and E-Trade and other companies around the US and even the world. And it turned out to be, at first people thought it was a very sophisticated attack, but it turned out to be a 14-year-old with the name of Mafia Boy. And just to tell you a story, we worked with I was at the Justice Department, we worked with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to get a wiretap on the house when we located where this person was. We didn't know who it was, but we knew the house it was coming from. And it turned out to be this 14-year-old. And we picked up on the wire that the 14-year-old's father was ordering one of his colleagues to be whacked. So it was really Mafia Boy and Mafia Dad. And then we've had, as we go forward, we've had things like the North Korean attack on Sony Pictures that I was closely involved in. And the wholesale theft of intellectual property and trade secrets that was a big concern between China and the US. And we also have threats that we haven't completely understood yet. We've had threats occasioned by new technologies like the Internet of Things, where people have been able to hijack those devices to use them as botnets or other tools. I had one Internet of Things joke, which is that, and this was a true story, as many of you know, where one attack was able to harness a lot of connected refrigerators to attack some financial institution websites. And I thought that was a great new example of freezing your assets. I know that joke needs a little work. But there are also other fears in terms of the integrity of data we're worried about. If the, you know, my friend, the former president of Estonia, Thomas Ilves, has said that, look, I worry if my website can't be reached, like what happened in Estonia in 2007, but I worry a lot more if someone gets into my my medical records and changes my blood type. So the next time I get a transfusion, I die. So integrity of data is another concern that we have. And then, you know, there are unforeseen threats. I would say that, you know, from the US government, we were not really, we really hadn't focused on the possible threat of interference with our democratic processes. The Russian interference with our democratic processes in the last election was not something that frankly was on the cyber community's radar screen, partly because it was a hybrid threat, a cyber-enabled threat, and partly because I think that we didn't think that could happen to us, but it was a very, you know, it was a wake-up call that we have to look beyond just the narrow cyber focus for these threats. And then, indeed, there are policy threats as well. Different countries have radically different visions of the future of the technology and what that means in terms of internet governance. There is a dichotomy even of the ways people speak of this. Some people talk about information security versus cybersecurity, and there's meaning to that because they want to control information. They want to control what they think of as the destabilizing nature of information, and that's very much at odds with the US and the European view. They want to focus on absolute sovereignty in cyberspace. And indeed, sovereignty has a role in cyberspace, but absolute sovereignty means complete control of information. To give you one example, this is a very nice placard that was in a hotel room in Beijing. As you can see, it has really interesting, nice renditions of all of the different logos for the Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, the New York Times, and Bloomberg. But if you look at the fine print, it says, in accordance with the regulations in China, the following websites are not accessible, including but not limited to. So it's a very interesting poster, but it's endemic of countries trying to control information. And of course, as I said earlier, you also have countries who are using the internet not just as a tool to communicate, but as a way to monitor and control citizens and to curtail human rights. So you have this, you know, you certainly have countries on both sides of that debate and that struggle, but you have a lot of countries in the middle who are developing world countries who are trying to decide what they want. They, of course, care about stability, but at the same time, they care about economic growth and openness. And so that's one of the big battles, is trying to make sure that the multi-stakeholder system that we and Olaf and others have been advancing for some time continues. And then you also have over 100 countries developing cyber offensive capabilities, which has become a new domain of war. Indeed, you know, this is something that's being debated around the globe, and the commission that Olaf and are on is one. This is one that the concerns we have is that, you know, after, with all these threats out there, including the nation state threats, including the development of cyber capabilities, offensive capabilities, it creates a very destabilized environment. And if you want the internet to be the force for good it has been, the force that has allowed us to achieve all the things we've been able to do over the years, maintaining the essential multi-stakeholder character, but also maintaining security as a platform so that people abandon these technologies is really important. I often say that, you know, with all that's going on, you know, back when I was first starting in this field, it was very difficult to get anyone to really care about cyber or cybersecurity, but now I think cyber is often seen as the new black. And that is a good thing and it's a bad thing. It means everyone is talking about the issue, but also there's a lot of, I think, confusion and misunderstanding about what we do about the issue. We are doing a number of good things as a global community to combat these threats, particularly internationally. I think there's been a lot of good achievements over the years. One key observation I'd have is that there has been a change of attitude. I know in the US, but I think in a number of countries that I've been to around the world, where it used to be that when you talked about cybersecurity to a cabinet member or a minister or a CEO of a company, their eyes would glaze over and they would run screaming from the room. They just didn't want to deal with it. They were like, that's a technical issue. You technical people go deal with that. And that's a very unfortunate thing, because it's not just a technical issue. It is a core issue of national security policy, of economic policy, of human rights policy. And indeed, just like you don't need to be an engineer, a pilot to know how to fly a plane, or you have to know how to be a pilot to fly a plane, but you don't need to be a pilot to understand the nature of what air war could do in a conflict. You don't need to be an engineer to understand the implications of some of these cyber threats, both policy and technical threats. Now, you want to make sure, of course, that you have a close coordination between the policy community and the technical community, and that's something that I think we need to strengthen. But you need to make sure that policymakers understand that this is a core issue of policy and should be mainstreamed as a core issue of policy. And frankly, I've seen a lot of movement toward that. It's not perfect. There's still a pretty big divide, but that's something I've seen, which has been a good thing. I've seen governments become more organized, and more all-of-government approaches to these things. I used to talk about, and I still talk about, silos of excellence in governments where different agencies don't really coordinate or talk to each other, or even talk to the private sector, civil society, and others about policy. That's getting better around the world. Certainly gotten better in the US and a number of other countries, but a core part of a lot of the capacity building efforts out there is to try to get all those stakeholders involved. Back in 2011, the US put out an international strategy for cyberspace. It was the first one at the time. And now there are a number of countries have been working on them or released them, including Australia recently. My old office was the first office in the foreign ministry when I left the White House to go over there in 2011, was the first one focused on cyber issues in a foreign ministry anywhere in the world. There are now 26 of those offices and growing, including most recently, Australia created an ambassador, Russia, China have them, Brazil, India, the UK, France, Germany, and many others. And that's, I think, very important because it makes it not just a technical issue, but a policy issue. And it's important to also focus on another issue. These are cross-cutting issues. The cybersecurity part of the issues is critically important, as we've talked about, but so are the human rights issues and the economic issues. And we need to be able to bring all those perspectives together, because if you just focus on the cybersecurity angle, you're missing, I think, a lot of the important things you need to do. So you have to bring all the perspectives together, all the stakeholders together, and make sure you're responding to these threats, because the threats are often cross-cutting too. As I said, threats, some of these absolute sovereignty ideas, either around cybersecurity or around internet governance, affect human rights and vice versa. So we've done a lot, I think, to do this. A lot of it has focused on trying to have dialogues between governments on these issues, which is really important. And we launched a number of them in the US, and a lot of countries have them, which I think that's a continuing important thing. There's been a lot of operational international cooperation on cybercrime. There is the Budapest Convention, which now I think over 60 countries are members of, and that's really important as a base document to make sure countries have consistent ways of punishing and investigating cybercrime. On cybersecurity, there has been a drive to have countries have national level certs, and that's really critical in terms of a building block. Computer emergency response teams or computer security incident response teams. I recently spoke to the FIRST conference, the Forum of Incident Response and Security Teams in Kuala Lumpur. Its 30th anniversary. That organization's grown tremendously, but getting more and more countries to have that building block is important. It's been important to make sure countries have things like national strategies for dealing with cybersecurity. That's been very important too. There's been a lot of capacity building work done around that. And we've also used diplomatic tools to fight cyber threats. I said in the beginning, what does those two slides have to do with each other, the zombies and the diplomats? Back a few years ago, there was a distributed denial of service attack that was launched from Iran on US financial institution websites. Now, it's a DDoS attack. It's not the end of the world, but it was a significant issue. And what we did is I went to over 20 of my counterparts around the world and talked to those diplomatic counterparts and said, hey, these are botnets. There are concentrations of those bots in different countries. Do what you can to help mitigate that. And many of those countries did, and that was a cooperative response to a shared threat by using what's called a diplomatic démarche. And building that international network to deal with those threats was important. Of course, negotiation is another key part. I think one of the key things we were able to negotiate is an agreement between the US and China, which later became a G20 statement, and also a bilateral statement with Germany, with the UK, and with Australia, between China and those countries, that says that a government should not engage in the theft of intellectual property using cyber means to benefit their own economy, their own commercial sector. And I think that was a key thing, and again, something that helps build larger stability. And then capacity building, I think, has been a key part of all of this. That it's great if you're developing these policies in your own country, but we need to have a sustained program to reach out to other countries to make sure they have the building blocks, they have the strategies, they have the ability to really both technically deal with these issues, but as a policy matter deal with these issues and join the conversation in the international community. I'd say a really strong thing there is the Global Forum for Cyber Expertise, which was launched by the Dutch and others, which I'm chairing one of the working groups on strategy and policy. And that's trying to bring different stakeholders together to really advance capacity building around the world. But there's lots of other capacity building efforts, including both by governments and by private organizations. So with all that, there's a lot of things we're doing to harden our targets. There's a lot we're doing to respond to threats. But a long-term effort, and a long-term, I think, diplomatic and policy effort, is how we try to shape the international environment for long-term and what I mean by that is it's a condition where every country and every stakeholder can enjoy the benefits of the internet, and no country has an incentive to disrupt it. So it's a state where you have much more security, I think we do now. You have much more stability than we do now, and it's something we've been trying to work toward. And it's not a short-term effort; it's a long-term effort. And that framework has, I think, three major components. One, the international law applies in cyberspace just like it does in the physical world. Cyberspace may have different attributes, but it's not so different from the physical world that it's a totally different thing. So it's very important that there's that commonality. The same law that applies, international law, in the physical world applies in the cyber world. Now we have to figure out exactly how that works, what some of these principles of international law mean apply to cyberspace. There's been good work that's been done there, but that's foundational. The second part of this framework is norms, and these are pictures of famous norms. Norms from Cheers, Norm Schwarzkopf, Norman Mailer. But I don't mean these norms. I mean norms of behavior of states. And there's been a lot of work done in the UN, and it's something called the Group of Governmental Experts that includes the US, it included Russia, China, and many other countries. So the permanent members of the Security Council plus many other countries, and it's had several meetings. And very importantly, that group was able to come to the conclusion, A, the international law applies, but B, that there are certain things that are below those very high thresholds. People talk about cyber war all the time. I'd say we haven't had a cyber war. We might have had cyber capabilities used in a shooting war, but that kind of cyber conflict hasn't happened yet. But we had a lot of conduct that's a major concern. And how can we work to thwart that? Well, one is the norm I talked about before. This was agreed to bilaterally and then in the G20. It's more of an economic norm that a state shall not conduct or knowingly support cyber-enabled theft of intellectual property, including trade secrets or business proprietary info, with the intent of providing commercial advantage to its companies or commercial sector. So that was a key one. But there are a number that I think are political military norms. One, for instance, is a state should not conduct or knowingly support online activity that intentionally damages or otherwise impairs critical infrastructure and provides services to the public. So I call that a peacetime norm because in wartime, of course, there are rules about proportionality, as they call it, distinction, not hitting civilian targets. But in peacetime, there's no reason for a country to attack the critical infrastructure of another, and at least as a voluntary norm, that's important. And we did get agreement in the UN system for that. Another one is a state should cooperate consistent with its domestic and international obligations with requests for assistance from another state in investigating cybercrime, collecting electronic evidence, and mitigating malicious activity. Again, that is a norm, not a restriction or a state not doing something, but for a state to do something affirmatively that would make the entire system more secure. And then the other key one is the state should not conduct or knowingly support activity intended to prevent national computer security incident response teams, or CSIRTs, from responding to cyber incidents, and the state should use those CSIRTs for defensive purposes and not offensive purposes. Enable online activities, they should not be used to enable activity that could do harm. That's a really important one, because if you think about it, the CERTs are like the ambulances and the hospitals of the internet. They're trying to protect everyone. They're trying to do a defensive mission, and states should not attack them. Now, Olaf and I are on something called the Commission for the Stability of Cyberspace, which is a commission that is not government. It has former government folks on it. It is chaired by the former foreign minister of Estonia, Maria Kaljaran. It has lots of luminaries from different parts of the internet community, from the policy community, from the technical community. And it's been looking at how we can advance this idea of stability in cyberspace. What else can we do? We've made a lot of progress as governments in the UN, but recently the UN group, the last meeting of it, ended in not being able to reach a conclusion. So what can we do to help that? And this commission is still meeting, but it is, its first norm that it was able to put out is that without prejudice to their rights or obligations, states and non-state actors should not conduct or knowingly allow activity that intentionally and substantially damages the general availability or integrity of the public core of the internet, and therefore the stability of cyberspace. So the public core is really those things like routing systems and other things that really are the core of the internet. And if you do something bad to them, that really would have a catastrophic effect for everyone. So we thought that was a very important norm to release. And more recently, we released a norm about state and non-state actors should not pursue or support or allow cyber operations intended to disrupt the technical infrastructure supporting elections, referenda, or plebiscites. Now, this doesn't deal with the issue of influence operations like using social media. This is actually attacks on those core systems. And it was important, I think, that this was done too. That's not the end of the commission's work. Norms are only one part of it. It's also to come up with a framework for stability going forward, and having that multi-stakeholder approach is, I think, really important. And I'd also say that there's been work in a lot of different international forums around that. For instance, there's been work in the Organization for Security and Cooperation for Europe on what's called confidence building measures. It's really the only parallel, I think, to the nuclear world, where you're trying to have transparency and confidence building measures between countries, things like hotlines, like exchanging points of contact, like exchanging doctrine. With the OSCE, there are a number of those confidence building measures that have been announced, and the OSCE also includes Russia as one of its members. And those are important because even if they're adversaries, you need to have these ways of communication. So that's been important. So if you look at that framework, international law norms, confidence building measures, and then the way ahead, that's the kind of stability framework we're trying to advance. Now, another part of that, though, is all of these are really important. It's really important to have these norms in cyberspace. It's really important to have these understanding. However, then they're basically rules of the road, if you will. But if there are no consequences for the people who act badly in cyberspace, or the people who break these rules, they're really just pieces of paper. They really don't mean a lot. So you have to make sure that you have consequences for these bad actors. And that's something that I think as an international community, and this is the deterrence part of my talk, that we've been pretty bad at, that we need to be much better at. And we certainly have had a number of instances recently where nation states have been bad actors. NotPetya was recently attributed to Russia by a number of countries. We had WannaCry attributed to North Korea by a number of countries. We've had this pre-positioning I mentioned just recently. We've had election interference. We've had lots of these things, but there haven't been really either what we call timely or credible costs. That's part of the way you work on this. So obviously hardening the targets, having better cybersecurity is locking the doors, but if someone breaks through that door nonetheless, there have to be some consequences so that it deters them and makes them think twice before doing this. And people have pointed often to the problems with attribution, the difficulty with attribution. And that is a difficult problem. However, we have been able to do it a number of times. We've been able to break through that barrier, not just following the technical footprints, but looking at everything. And that's been a really important way of doing it. And at the end of the day, attribution is in part a technical issue, but it's also a political issue. Back when I was a prosecutor, the standard was in a criminal trial beyond a reasonable doubt. It's not beyond all doubt. And so I think we need to make sure that we understand where we can actually start both naming and shaming, announcing people who've done these things, but also taking more action. I'm heartened. I'm glad that there's been a number of recent examples where the international community or subsets of it have come out and say someone is responsible, Russia, North Korea, etc., for a particular major bad act. But that naming and shaming is not enough. We also have to think of consequences that will not be escalatory, but will change the behavior of that other party. And I think that's not a job just for governments to think about that. I think that's a job for all stakeholders, because the government tool set is relatively limited. It's diplomatic. You have diplomatic options. You have economic options like sanctions. You have cyber options, which I think are largely overplayed or overemphasized. And you have kinetic options, which you're not going to use unless there's really death and destruction. So that's not a huge tool set, but you need, I think, to supplement that and think about what other tools we can use to actually change the behavior of some of these bad actors out there. And what I think we really need is not just one country acting alone. I think the best course is to have collective action. If you have the fiery ball of cyber debt heading toward you as a country, of course you have to do something to protect yourself. But if you can act together with other countries, I think that's really much stronger. And that joint attribution we've seen recently has been helpful. The other thing I think we have to do is focus on not just the ordinary technical threats or even the advanced technical threats, but also of these hybrid threats, these threats like undermining elections and democracy, things we haven't seen before. And that requires, I think, that bridges be built between the technical community, the policy community, and the different parts of the policy community who deal with different parts of these issues. So just wrapping up, my end is that, this is a field that's going to continue to grow. These threats are going to continue to grow. Government interest is going to continue to grow. It's really important, I think, for all of us to work together and ensuring that cyberspace is going to thrive. And part of that is hardening the targets, better cybersecurity. Part of it is consequences. Part of it is making sure we have the right policies in place. And part of it is making sure we have a team approach that involves countries working with each other, countries working with other stakeholders like the private sector and civil society. That's all going to be important. And all of you are part of the solution. I remember when I began the talk, I talked about the movie Colossus. Well, many of you know, if you go to Bletchley Park, where the Enigma code was broken and the Lorenz code from World War II, you can see this, which is as a rebuild of the original Colossus, which was a computer that was used. It was the first electronic digital computer that was used to break what's called the Lorenz code, which was the code that was used by Hitler and his high command to communicate, even harder than the Enigma code. And that was really important because that is a Colossus, in this case, that served a beneficial purpose and not a bad purpose. So Colossus doesn't have to be dystopian. It could be helpful. It could be hopeful for society. So if we want to avoid this future, another cyber movie, The Terminator, a much more dystopian future, and instead have this, It's a Wonderful Life. Now, this is not a cyber movie, I confess. We really need to work together to both understand what these threats are, but also very much focus on how we can combat them together and what the new threats are. So with that, let me stop there, and I'll turn it to Olaf to moderate some questions and answers.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chris. I was looking at the Colossus picture, and I was trying to recognize it because in Fort Maud there is this beautiful little museum. So Fort Maud is where the NSA is, but there is a public museum there where they have all kinds of encryption tools, and there's actually I think the device is called the Bomb, which was the computer that did the same as Colossus, but then for the Americans.
Yeah. Well, the bomb was used to simulate the routers on the Enigma devices. So Colossus was more advanced because the Lorenz code was more advanced than the Enigma code, as I understand it.
Right. Right. Anyway, this, for anybody who ever comes to either the UK, visit Bletchley, and for anybody who visits the Maryland environment, go to this little charming museum, which which is really, really nice.
I would agree, it's very interesting. And I also say that you mentioned my movie poster collection. I'm up at number 37 now, so I try to do one a week. I think I'll easily make it to 52, but if people have suggestions, I'm always looking for them.
So back to a little bit of a more serious reflection on your talk. There's many things that we can reflect on. In the meantime, if you have questions, I have one hand up at this moment from a participant, which we'll get to. But if you have questions, please let me know in the chat box so that we can put your question forward. So you were talking about the collective action and what we can do. And when you were saying that, you were mostly saying what we can do as countries. I think that a lot of this infrastructure is obviously managed by private entities. And there's a bunch of questions around that. Do you want private entities to be engaged in taking collective action? This is questions like hackback. Or, for instance, depeering could be an option if you see a bad actor somewhere. However, that's not always in the interest of, say, specific private actors in the field. It's not often in the interest to lose a few 100 million customer base. How do we deal with that very specific environment where the offense is in the hands of a very small set of actors, state actors, hacker groups, and the ones that you described, and the defense is carried by a broad swath of the private sector?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously I think this goes beyond governments alone. Now, governments certainly have certain powers and capabilities that are unique to governments. Certain things they can do in terms of economic sanctions, et cetera, or diplomatic actions they can take. I think, and I agree with you that I think the private sector plays obviously plays a leading role in terms of defense of networks, because most of the networks are theirs, and that hardening the target, what we call deterrence by denial, is something that they are obviously really the best people to do. Now, there should be good interaction between the government and the private sector to help that, but that's a key aspect. In terms of taking action, I think really what this requires is a partnership to try to identify what these actions could be, thinking outside the box, if you will, but also thinking about what the second and third order consequences are. I agree. I mean, one thing that's been suggested is if you have a malicious nation state, you could black hole traffic from, or you said depeer traffic from them. That has, that may have a major effect on that country. It also may have a major effect on your country, and on your private sector. So I don't expect the private sector to be in the front row of actually imposing the costs. I think for the reasons you state, that's problematic because they don't want to be the target of a nation state by having done that. But at the same time, I think they can help us think through what these other options might be and figure out both what the pros are and the consequences are, so we can start thinking about this in a more creative way.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask people to ask their questions. Tariq, you had a question. You signaled that to me privately. Would you like to ask that?
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much, Olaf. I have got a chance to attend the GCSC session in person in recent IETF 102 meeting as well in Montreal. I have a question and an objection as well. I'm sorry if the objection is too harsh, but we are having election here in Pakistan since yesterday, and we have faced a very massive cybersecurity attack on one of the Election Commission of Pakistan system that was used to transfer results over the internet to the Election Commission of Pakistan, termed as the Result Transmission System, RTS, which has been damaged the election process very massively. And we know the adversary cross border, and I have seen the members in the GCSC document as well, and I have objection on, I mean, the countries that are actively involved in destabilizing the democratic process through cyber attacks are also having members in the GCSC document. So that is the objection from my side, that at least only those members should be included that has a clean hands, at least, and they are not involved in any kind of cyber security attacks, especially on the democratic process of any country. And my question is about the non-interference with the public core heading, where there is written that no non-state actors should not conduct or knowingly allow any activity. So I mean, how will it be if a non-state actor does not obey these terms and conditions? Who will be responsible and accountable of their act? If the attack originating country is identified, what kind of penalty or sanction that country can face for a non-state actor act, actually? And third thing is that attackers are much sophisticated and they launch such activities from different geography instead of their own. So if an incident occurs, what mechanism will be adopted to track back the adversary to guarantee that no country can propagate self-launched rumors against any country? So these are actually some concerns in a kind of questions if can be addressed. I was trying to ask this question at the GCSE session in IETF 102, but due to the time limitation, I did not got a chance to ask this question, so that's why I'm asking this.
Thank you, Tariq. Thank you. So I heard sort of the objection about nation states that are involved in cyber attacks and cyber warfare or cyber whatever we want to call it, are represented in the Commission. That's one. I've heard you ask about the state and non-state actors and how we're going to help the non-state actors accountable. And then thirdly, I've heard you ask around the attribution if a non-state actor is actually basically doing something via a route that is not directly attributable. Chris, do you want to respond to any of these questions?
Yeah, I mean, so first I should point out the Commission has no current government people on it. It's not a government commission. It's a commission. The GCSC is made up of some former government people, some industry people, and some civil society and academic folks. So it's really broad-based, and it's not meant to have current government representatives on it. It's supposed to help that process. You know, I also, but on a larger scale, sometimes it's very important, even if you have a country that is doing bad things, to try to engage that country and get them to agree that things are not permissible so that there's some accountability. For instance, when China agreed on the intellectual property theft issue, that created a level of accountability, and I think that helps stability more generally. So I say that to that. On the second question, but at the same time, you don't want to reward bad state actors. You don't want to make them. You may want to make sure that you have the right working level relationships, but not reward bad state acts. On the second question, holding non-state actors accountable for, say, attacking the public core, that really has to fall to states, I think, because at that point, if you have criminals and others attacking the public core, that is a crime. And I should say the norm we suggested is a norm we've suggested. It hasn't been adopted by nation states yet, but I can imagine. But if you're hacking into the things that, like the DNS server, that's happening somewhere, and that's likely a crime, and those states should go after it. And on the third issue, which is essentially the issue, I think, of proxies, that there's something that was agreed to even in this GGE meeting, that you can't do something as a nation state through a proxy that you can't do as a nation state. In other words, you shouldn't be able to use proxies. Now, you're quite right. People do use proxies. But I think that when we're trying to do attribution, we don't look solely at just the digital evidence. We look at things like motive. We look at money flows. We look at human intelligence. We look at the whole range of different issues.
Thank you. Yeah, I just want to give a little bit of a background on the Commission because I think it's important. The Commission was sort of, the initiative for the Commission came out of the Dutch government and a number of other governments. Singaporean government was involved. I believe Estonia was involved. But they consciously, and I think this is the first time in the cyber diplomatic sort of sphere that people tried to get something of a multi-stakeholder approach and not only have diplomats and state negotiators in the room, but actually get a somewhat broader set of participants. And I think that is quite a unique experiment, to be honest. And obviously, the result of the work is up for voluntary adoption in a very internety way. It's a group of people that is informed by their own knowledge, but also informed by their constituency. Frankly, whenever I hear something about the critique or a perspective that I have not heard in the Commission before, I will actually try and bring it back. I see that as my role in the Commission, and I bet that Chris has the same sort of approach. If he hears something that is a concern of the people he talks to and he sort of represents, he brings that back. Obviously, we're not representatives, but that I see that as my role. With that, I want to go to a few other questions. I had, let me see if I do this right, wrong mouse. We had Tariq, he asked this question. Narishiman. I don't pronounce your name right. I apologize, but if you could ask your question.
A very good evening to one and all. Am I audible?
Yes,
Yep.
yes.
Actually, as far as this offensive security is concerned, people from very big populated countries like India and all, we are facing a lot of cyber attacks. Even government websites are being hacked. So that this will be the right forum in order to discuss what are the kind of security measures which we want to proactively take.
Okay. So, as I understood your question, there's lots of attacks all the time on government websites, on other things. What are the practical security measures that we can take? And I think the part of it is just that level of awareness to make sure that governments actually understand the scope of this problem. I'd say India has done a lot in this. I know that within their National Security Advisor's office, there's an individual named Gulshan Rai who's been running this. I've known him for about 20 years, and we've dealt a lot with India. The US and India signed a comprehensive memorandum of understanding about a year and a half or about 2 years ago on a whole range of cyber issues and cooperation. This really does have to be something where we're working together as countries, and it depends on who the attackers are, but certainly one thing is hardening the targets, doing that deterrence by denial, by doing better cybersecurity and just hygiene, which is important, making sure you have the right controls in place. That's more technical, but part of it is also getting at the highest levels of government, people understanding this is a big issue and putting resources behind it. I think India has been moving and doing that direction, just like the US has. It's a hard problem though, because I think offense often beats defense.
Yeah, I think that is a. Go ahead.
Actually, as per our professor told, even though the intelligence bureau and all the government agencies are working hard for that, but when we compare with the largest populated nation, that is China, they have some better security solutions. in order to, what to say, defend against this cyber warfare. And as you rightly told, what to say, United States and India made many memorandum of understandings to avoid such what to say, very vulnerabilities. But what about this what to say, that is the VPNs? The more number of VPNs are now being given at a free of cost, and the people are making use of creating usernames, what to say, for 5 or 6 days. So after that, they are creating another username and set of usernames and passwords and accessing that VPN. Is there any possibility to control such vulnerability? Because through that VPN, more number of security and malware injections are being done.
Look, I think that's a hard technical question. I also think there's a policy question there too. In one way, you don't want to discourage people having VPNs because in certain places it's important for them to have the anonymity to be able to, you know, engage in speech, engage in discourse, talk about personal items, you know, criticize their governments if they want to. So there's VPNs serve a lot of good purposes. You know, technically, I agree there's some threats there too, and I don't know the answer to that, but it's something we have to look at both sides.
I'm afraid that we will not be able to solve these questions on the call, but this is certainly something that SIG is interested in. I'm going to take 2 more questions, and those are the questions that I had so far. I have an individual called Clio asking a question. Can you?
Yeah, my question was, the United States is a disproportionate center for value at risk from the cyber perspective. So some reports show that cyber losses are suffered by, overall worldwide cyber losses are 50% suffered by the US. My question is, given the enormous value at risk from these statistics, why is there not explicit US government, military, and/or intelligence agency focus on direct intervention to improve US societal cyber resilience?
So I think, you know, part of it is a resource question. I agree. The U.S. is probably the most exposed to cyber risk because we're the most dependent on it. Now that will change over time. Many more countries will get to that point, but that is a big issue. And there's been a lot of work to try to heighten this issue over time. I am concerned. I don't think the answer is to have one single agency, one ring to rule them all that's going to do this. I think you need to leverage all the different capabilities you have, whether it's the Defense Department, the Homeland Security Department, the Justice Department, the State Department, and the White House. I will say I'm concerned that we need to continue making this a priority. There's great people at DHS now. There are great people in state and other places that are working on this. But we need to have leadership at the very top. I was concerned when the cybersecurity coordinator in the White House that position was eliminated, because that was an important position to herd all those cats, get everyone together on the same page, and really work with the private sector. The other issue that you raise is there's a lot of work that can be done to share information between the private sector and the government. I don't think the government should have a role in preventing and working to respond to nation state threats that are targeting the private sector. But there's a lot that the government just can't do. They can't go in and secure every individual network. They have, through the National Institute for Standards and Technology, come up with best practices for critical infrastructure. I think we need to do more in that realm as well. But I just don't think the government can be responsible for all cybersecurity in the private sector, but they need to be able to share information more.
And I would like to add to this one that if you talk about government, military, intel agency focus and intervening in sort of the same line, that you very rapidly get into this escalatory discussion. What does that mean? What does military or government intervening mean? And I think that what we're doing in the Commission is also talking about those boundaries. What happens if something from the outside comes in to a particular nation state, and what are the means to keep the other parties accountable against violating the norm or the societal compact? I don't think we have a clear answer to, well, except for the norms that we're trying to develop and that are already put in the GDE context. That those norms are being developed, but I don't think we have a good solid answer. Chris, do you think that's sort of a right assessment?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that, I also said that it depends on what actors we're talking about. If it's a criminal actor, we need to step up law enforcement. There's been a lot of work to do that, certainly. It's hard, but there's been a lot of work. If it's a nation state actor, one of the things we need to do is be able to impose timely and effective consequences, and this goes to my deterrence point, and we haven't done that. Of course, we have to worry about undue escalation, but there are ways to control escalation. I think we just haven't really mainstream the issue enough for people to understand it. When you had the poisonings in Salisbury, there's a very quick response there. When you had the NotPetya worm, it wasn't announced that it was attributed to Russia until 7 months later. And at the time it was said, we're going to do something about it, but nothing was really done. So, and it was done subsequently, but I'd say not as effective enough. So yes, we need to impose consequences, but we also need to avoid escalation. We need to be able to walk that path. And coming up with things like norms and stability frameworks help countries understand what that framework is going to be and what the consequences might be.
So I just want to make a quick comment. So I appreciate the feedback, and I think it's sensible. But the point I was getting at is that, as an InfraGard member, I'm exposed to a lot of the law enforcement side interactions. Mm-hmm. However, the reality is that the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, intelligence agencies, the U.S. military, while there are definitely great people there, I completely agree with that. They do not have any organizational focus on even communicating things that could be done in the civilian sector to improve. Nor are they pushing things like laws. For example, we have seatbelt laws, right? These are being pushed by insurance companies to reduce losses for auto drivers. I don't see why that dynamic doesn't exist similarly for cyber.
So I'll just say very quickly, I think information sharing does need to be better. I think DHS is supposed to announce something next week about that to try to heighten that. That's always been a problem. I think when you get into regulation, it's hard because regulation is a dirty word in the US, and I don't think you're going to get that through Congress. I think that might change over time, however. I'm a former lawyer. There's not litigious people in the US and lawyers who would be willing to take the cases, but there's no real standard of care yet. And we need to start figuring out what is the standard of care. That helps to drive insurance, that helps drive liability, it helps drive information sharing. I think we're going to see that in the next few years.
Thank you.
That's almost a heads up to the IoT talk that we will be, the IoT topic that we will be discussing in future SIG. I have Peter Koch as a question, and somebody else brought in a question. Let's do those two. Peter, get prepared to ask your question. The question from Mr. Haves, who does not have a mic, is, do you think cryptocurrency will increase cyber attack as it provides an anonymous payment method? So it's a sort of a crystal ball question. And Peter, what's your question?
So I'm going to read what I wrote into the chat. Thanks, Olaf, and thank Chris in advance. So one of the norms that was presented on the slides suggested that states should not engage in or permit malicious activity of certain kinds to happen from within their territory. Now, territoriality is an interesting concept in cyberspace. So the question is, how would that fit, and what could be other descriptions, or what nomenclature would be used to determine domains of responsibility or accountability? This obviously has echoes what is happening in law enforcement terms, attribution, cross-border things, and so on and so forth.
I mean, states are generally responsible for taking for what happens on the territory. However, they have to have the capability to do it. So what that norm is again, these are voluntary norms, but it is an expectation that a state will take action to mitigate a threat coming from their territory. I think you can extend that a little bit, though. If the state doesn't do that, if the state says, hey, we can't do it because we don't have the capability to do it, or we can't do it because actually we don't care, or these are people that we're sponsoring, then I think that might trigger another state or actor to take action on their own. Now that's very, that's a very slippery slope. That's very difficult because you get into escalatory issues. But I think, if the state says we don't have the capability, then we need to work with them to get the capability. If the state says we don't care about it, we're going to be a safe haven, that's where I think other states can take action.
On the cryptocurrency question, you have a perspective?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's possible, certainly, and I think we've seen that in a couple of instances recently, and I think it's been reported that actually was used even for the election interference in our election. So it's, I think that's possible. There's been internet currencies, electronic currencies in the past that were used for illegal purposes because it's hard to trace them. We'll see. I mean, I think that's something that has to be factored in as we look at the policy around cryptocurrencies.
Okay, I think that since we're a few minutes over time, over the hour, I enjoyed this session. I think we could engage in a little bit of longer discussion, but I want to be conscious of everybody's time. Thank you very much for engaging in discussion. If the SIG has any feedback to the Commission, please let us know. Please forward questions to me or Chris. The recording will be made available. And with that, I would like to ask everybody for their participation. I think that at the high point of this session, we had over 60 people, which is a nice turnout. Thank you very much, Oscar, for organizing this, and thank you very much for Chris to participate.
And Oscar and Olaf, thank you to both of you, and thanks to the people on the call. And I'd say this, I think one of the things we need to do, and I tried to do this when I was in government, when I was in the Justice Department, I tried to build bridges between the CERT community and the law enforcement community, for instance, which didn't necessarily trust each other in the beginning. But the folks in this SIG, I think, are important voices in the policy debate. And I would echo what Olaf said, is that it's really important to get your perspective, to get your thoughts. That's important because the policy community and the technical community don't always talk enough and don't really understand each other enough. So I think that's important. So thank you for today.
Thank you all. Oscar, any last words?
Yes, I just want to thank Chris and you for joining us today, and also the members that also took the time to join us. So thank you all, and stay tuned because we're gonna have another webinar in August 6th. On August 6th, we're gonna have James Lewis from CSIS. Stay tuned.
Right.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.